Okay, here we have Tanto Monta, the third game of what's now a trilogy, starting with Here I Stand and Virgin Queen, both of which Ed Beach wrote. And then this one is written by a Spaniard. I do not remember his name. Carlos Diaz Narvaez, but with input and consultations with Ed Beach. At the very least, Ed Beach did the copy editing for the rules, but I'm sure he had other input in it because this is sort of his core design. Now, these are the official games in the series. I know of at least one more unofficial. Wars of Religion is kind of close, but this Time of Wars, however, it's a bit of a mess. The rules are problematic in that one. It's interesting, though. That gives you a Eastern view of this same series. Now, when does that give you? 1590 to 1660. Which would put it after Virgin Queen. To me, I mean, when Here I Stand came out, it was sort of the, and designed as the answer to a Mighty Fortress, to make a good game out of a Mighty Fortress, basically. And I think it did a fantastic job of that. I got to Virgin Queen and said, you know, it's that same core system, but there's too much. It's too busy. There's too much game state represented by counters and tracks and such not. It just didn't catch me the same way. I played it once. And Here I Stand, I played multiple times. Of course, I'm down to can only play things once now, but I think Virgin Queen was at a point where I might have played it again had it really hit me as more exciting than it did. And this one, unfortunately, is going further in that same direction, becoming an even more, like, my complaint with Virgin Queen was it was too overburdened for a CDG. This one looks like it's going to be much, much worse. Now, I'm going to approach this a little differently than I've approached the other games of the series because of that. Which is to say, I was able to cope with the vastly overburdened, maybe not CDG, but pulsed, etc., Europa Universalis Price of Power, which has huge amounts of game state, you know, reflected on cards and such not. It's hard to keep track of what the fuck's going on because of that. Just as it will be here, there's all these counters to represent all the different information that you have. Players are going to have large hands of cards. They have complicated cards with multiple events on them that they have to choose between. It pushes the limits, as far as I'm concerned, of what you can kind of do with a CDG. And the question then becomes, can I play it differently? I could play Here I Stand as a competitive and an enjoyable type of game in which you kind of have your goals in mind. You can look at other people's victory situations and try to prevent them from winning. Very much like the coin games at least also started out. They followed a similar process, though, where they just started getting heavier and heavier and putting more and more burden on this impulse kind of driven mechanism. Here I Stand was so beautiful because it hit that sweet spot for me. Sort of, it was close to the limit of the complexity you can get away with in this kind of pulse type of game, okay? As more games have come out of its type, of its ilk, these two in the series, and that Time of Wars, and there may be one more that is really, really based on this. I'm not sure. I've certainly run into things that feel, you know, that feel very similar, but how true they are to it is kind of the question. But anyway, out of the four games that I can list by name and say definitely are influenced, you know, are of the same family, even if Ed Beach wasn't involved in one of them at all, and it is truly a mess. They just keep getting more and more complex and more burdened. And like I said, Here I Stand may have been at about that limit for me. Obviously, there are people who love Virgin Queen. There are a few people, well, I've gotten one comment from someone who likes this one. Most people, it's just too much for them as well, that have commented who have any experience with it. Like, they tried it and said, yeah, I couldn't even get it set up or something along those lines. Like, I know somebody who's tried to set it up 3 times and failed every time. And I understand why. It is difficult to figure out what the setup is. And it is really a pain in the ass to cope with all these different little counters and everything that just represent game state conditions. And many of them are like victory point counters that you have to hunt down, some of which are just piles of the same counter, which could have been handled on a track or something along that line. If you had a victory point track for each power, that would work. It's okay. I did resolve some of my setup woes and discovered a couple of things. I did a previous video on setup woes as I was working my way through, and I was just like, this is fucking ridiculous. The first, one of the first things that I discovered was just, you know, what a pain in the ass it is. Oh, actually, there are a couple of errors to begin with. Well, so one of the things that really irked me that I found in the original was I couldn't figure out how they got the victory points that they have listed. If you add up the victory points that you have on a player card, it doesn't add up. But what I missed was, and this is going to be problematic, these triangles are a victory point each. I kind of knew that, but there's no way to record them on the cards as opposed to just about everything else. So again, a track for the number of triangles you had would fit in with the other victory point things. It would be a counter that you could use, and that way you have these piles of counters, like for example this Renaissance thing. There's just a pile of like 4 or 5 different counters being used for that with different numbers of victory points, and you make change with them and whatever to indicate how many you've got from that. Well, that could all be handled on a track, right? And similarly, the number of triangles you have could be counted on that same track. Most of the powers have 2 or 3 of those piles, maybe more, I don't know, that have to be dealt with. Another factor, the fuck is this? Uh-oh. Canaries. Okay. Yeah. Another factor is it doesn't tell you that you should do this, and I'm not sure that it's well, I'm sure it's not necessary, but I have put little piles of little counters for locations that have special victory point counters for them on the board to help remind me of things that I should be targeting, because I'm not going to be able to remember, and these are some of the special cases in the rules. One thing that I discussed is that the rules are 60 pages long, which feels huge for, you know, a CDG especially. And this is the thing. I've got to take away my mindset from CDG and move towards the mindset that I had with the original Europa Universalis. Now, the original Europa Universalis doesn't have the same penalties that a CDG has. A CDG adds a certain amount of pain to the play of the game. And I explained that in my setup woes. Essentially, you make all your decisions for a given country during a planning phase in Europa Universalis. Here, you're making them on each card play, essentially. So everything is interactive. It's much, much harder, even as a single player, to plan what the hell you're doing and how you want to cope with it. And obviously that increases significantly playing solo, which I like to do. Even if, if I'm going to play a game of this nature, I want to get at least a couple solo plays in if I'm going to play it opposed, right? But all my gaming is solo at this point, so that's okay. It's just CDGs tend to add another burden to the play of a game in addition to all this, all this game state that's being maintained on counters and whatnot. Because I have to pick up a hand of cards each player's turn, look at all the cards, contemplate them all. Boy, did we run into this in the recent CDGs I've been playing, because the type of games that I'm interested in that are being made as CDGs keep getting fucking heavier and heavier, all right? Which is really problematic. For example, there was a fairly small list of actions in Here I Stand. Virgin Queen had a larger list. I think it's gotten even larger. Every country has its own set of actions, its own costs. So you have to play each country, and that's part of the series, right? One thing that's going to help a little bit in this one is it's only a 4-player game. That's going to help a significant amount. This one's actually the predecessor to Here I Stand. It handles the early stages of exploration, where the Portuguese and where the Portuguese are exploring their way to the Indian Ocean, where the Spaniards are exploring to find the New World, and both France and the Muslims, the other two sort of main factions, also have some capability to do exploration, but it's much more limited. Speaking of factions, just to make things more complex, every player has sort of a main country that they're the faction of. So you've got like Spain, Portugal, the Muslims, and France. But they have a secondary major power. Okay, so Spain has, I don't even remember what these are fucking called. Oh, Spain is broken into two powers because the crown is not fully united. So you have Castile and Aragon. Makes sense. I don't have a Castile marker. I don't know why that is. I cut these little things off the, there it is. I cut these little things off the counter sheet, and in this game, they're pretty useful to help remind me what color each power represents. Okay, so that kind of makes sense that they would have two different separate powers that are working together, because they don't really fight, but they don't completely integrate. Portugal has these Belatranejos. It's almost like a minor power. It is It is part of the Castilian Civil War that's going on, because when Isabel takes the throne, her niece has probably a better claim to the throne, having been. Isabel was actually excluded from the crown by her brother, and his daughter, which would be the more direct bloodline under any kind of legal arrangement, has a better claim, essentially. However, the nobles mostly support Isabel. Well, this Beltranejos. That was kind of her nickname, La Beltranejos. But anyway, is she an Isabel as well? I don't remember what her name is. It's not Isabel. Joanna. Okay. So Castile starts out in a civil war, and Portugal controls half that one part of that civil war. And until it gets dissolved, essentially. You would say, well, it's kind of like a subordinate power or something. You could probably do this more like a major power and a subordinate power, but every country is basically designed around two major powers, and that's one of theirs. For the Muslims, it's much more equal. Now, they actually kind of have three, but not really. The first one is it's Granada. I'm trying to remember what it's called. Nazareth. I guess that's like the ruling faction or whatever, family. I don't know. But you would be more familiar with it as you know, as Granada. And this is towards the end of the Reconquista, so you have the two Spanish powers, or are they both involved in it? Certainly Castile is. Castile is very heavily involved in wanting that as a goal, but you know, essentially Spain is trying to take Granada back. Second one is the North Africans, which for the most part are over here. Now, you'll see there's Portuguese all over here, because the Portuguese have already established territory within some of that North African controlled area. And so there's a war already at place here. And you can take a look at some of these. So Portugal's at war with North Africa. Aragon Castile's at war with Portugal. France is at war with Aragon Castile. But Aragon and Castile are not at war with whatever this other thing is. However, they don't have their own little thing. Aragon Castile is at war with Beltranejo. Let's keep going. Let's look at France as well then. So France, obviously their major power is France itself, but their secondary power is also a civil war. It's the Catalonian opposition to Aragon. And again, the expectation is that Aragon will win the civil war there. In addition, you have a host of minor powers, some of which are treated differently from others. I talked about there were a couple of errors in the setup. Let me jump back to that. A couple of the locations are written using the Spanish term, I think, for the location on the map, and or maybe the Spanish in the setup instructions and the Portuguese on the map, or something along that line. And you can kind of find them. Just be aware that there are a couple of locations that are in North Africa that are not consistently named between the two. So if you're looking for where to set something up, yeah, you're going to find two that don't work. Another thing, unless I lost a counter or something, there are not enough Venetian units. So this one with a cross I have to use. That is actually units with that kind of crossed swords, or a cross of a different type, are reserved for an event to trigger them. I wonder where my rulers are. Huh. I guess they're on the board. Okay. These are on the board and the others are in the deck of cards. You have a variety of minor powers, which again, you have a diplomacy situation with, First of all, they have a position in which they give you a diplomatic condition, which may be permanent. So, for example, Catalonia is always at war with Aragon Castile. Beltranejo is always at war with Aragon Castile. The papacy is always at war with the Muslims. That can be changed. Always is a strong term. But essentially, they start at war with them, and until they're defeated, they are at war. The papacy can survive the Muslims defeating them. The other two factions, when they're defeated, they are destroyed. Oh, what was I going to go with? I got some other stuff that also there were not enough counters for. I think one of these independent stacks has like some tribals under it, because I have extra tribals. I think they're going to run out. Like, there's going to be less of those counters on the board eventually, fairly, after a bit of time, and I'm not going to be taxing the counter mix as much. Those neutrals and whatnot are going to take more damage than they receive. What else do you have? You have off-board stuff. So you have the Canary Islands, which I think is right off here. Yeah, Cape Bojador, or Bojador, sorry, it's connected to that. And that's a major goal for Spain and an interesting option for Portugal that they probably, within their war with Spain, they can probably cause difficulties for the Castilians in terms of preventing them from getting the Canary Islands. Oh, another thing that I found problematic, and I talked about this in my setup thing, the colors for the Portuguese and the Castilians, almost exactly the same. And there's nowhere that really, I don't think that there's anywhere that tells you the actual colors that each of these nations, that each of these powers has. They really should be labeled. The minors are all labeled. That makes them a little easier to deal with. The fleets are labeled. When you're starting to get colors that are exactly the same, that's problematic. And I also found some of the cavalry to be hard to discern that it's cavalry. This looks like it's one man running in front of another. That's the front of the horse on there. I talked about that already as well. You have a bunch of different types of units in the game. You have regular infantry, militia, cavalry, which sometimes has different images on it, like that has camels, boats. The French and the Spaniards have artillery. And by using different images on stuff and everything, it's usually not that big a problem, but it does feel kind of weird. And then there's like these mystery pieces that I do not know what they are for. Maybe they're these bowmen. They're obviously linked with North Africa somehow. I'm hoping some kind of card tells me something about it. Since there are militia here, this counter mix has to be used for whatever this is, Morocco, Fez, something like that. Yeah, Fez. But when the Barbary pirates come in, creating another card, maybe they're this, maybe not. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me either way. But yeah. Now, I say it's important that there's militia for this side because these actually do not have militia. Militia are distinguished by having a black figure on them instead of a colored one. And therefore, this counter mix has to be used for these guys. I'm not so sure about those. If they end up getting added to the counter mix to give me more pieces or something, or what's going on with them, I don't have an answer for that. With all the special rules, I don't recall there being one that dealt with that particular case. All right, what else do you have in this mess? Like I said, there's a rest of the world map as well, and you're going to be doing exploration on here. And you get victory points for exploring. You get these cartography victory points if you're one of the first 2 players to get a successful exploration of the area to a certain degree. In addition to the minors that are named, things like Genoa and such not, you also have independents, which are just factored with these guys, which also do not have, oh, well that's interesting. Okay, there were enough Venetian points. I expected these not to be the way they are. So there we go. We got 3 strength points there, and 2 there, and that way I can give this back, and I can put this with Venice. Yeah, and if I don't have enough independence, I actually do, because on the reverse side they have different numbers. Same as this thing. I didn't think that would be the case. Normally infantry on the backside is militia, but independents have no reason they would have militia, so it does make sense that there wouldn't be any on there. You can see there's militia for these major powers here. It may be that no minor power has militia, that nothing but the major powers has militia, and that may actually be expressed in the rules, and I just didn't it didn't sink in the same way. I'm going to be swapping batteries, and then I'll come back and talk more about what we see on the map, what we see elsewhere, as I fumble my way through this. It's going to take a while. Part of the introduction is just going to be going over what you have in the game, and I'm going to kind of touch on some of the component issues as well. Things like the fact that, you know, it was really hard to tell Portugal from Aragon. It's probably not going to be too big a deal now, but when I punched my counters and bagged them and whatnot, I'm not so sure I got them in the right places. Like it looked like one country. Anyway, a consolidated victory point track. I believe when you go over 48, you win. It's not the only way to get automatic victory, though. Like in Here I Stand, you can get an automatic victory by getting all your keys on the board, but there's a restriction here. Any of these that you have, they're home keys, you have to have possession of. Otherwise, you will not get you won't get the automatic victory from that. You can also get an automatic victory by being, I think, 7 points ahead of the next player, maybe 8, I don't know. So if you can get a significant lead, which makes it feel, I don't remember if Here I Stand had a mechanism like that. I know it had the automatic victory conditions. I think there was a victory point based one as well. And finally, if you get to the end of the game, everybody counts their victory points, and the person with the most ends up winning. This tracks your consolidated victory points from on your card, and you will see some players already have some little victory point counters. Now this is for locations they hold. So if they lose that location, they will lose the victory point for that, at least temporarily. And then what I'll do is I'll put that little victory point marker over near the location so I can remember that that's an interesting place to them. I guess you could keep your own markers near you, but I think some of them are actually multinational. For example, the Barcelona victory points. Now this is different. These are not just for holding Barcelona. These are kind of each turn that you have Barcelona, you get points. And I think it's triggered by a card. I'm not sure. I can't recall. We'll have to get some grasp on the rules somehow. Obviously there's a turn track. There is a space naus, whatever. These are ships that are capable of going into the rest of the world. To some extent, fleets are able to go, I think, into some of the oceans out there. but in order to intercept and such not, and we'll touch the rules for that. But those analyses are what are going to generally be conducting your exploration. Well, they're solely going to be, it's possible off a card, so. They're going to be conducting your exploration, and they also ship resources back. Resources. We have two different types of resources in the game. Big cup of naval resources, which are ones that are basically gathered from the rest of the world map. And they give a number of things. They can give you command points that you're allowed to spend, kind of as you would the command points on a card. Okay? And they could give you cards, or a card, which just gives you an extra draw when you expend it. Or they can give you victory points, which just goes into your victory point pile and gets tracked. I don't think they're hidden, those victory points. But they're hidden while they're still resources. But I think they're revealed when you play them. There are also caravan resources over here. A different set that's essentially the same kind of things. The distributions may be different. I didn't see anything that said that. These handle routes, not this one, here as well. That if the Muslim player can maintain those routes linked up, he can get the resources from them. Some of the players start with resources already at the beginning of the game. And again, they're hidden when they have. And when they do, they're the 2 command point resources at the beginning setup, rather than just a random resource counter. So, you know, it's just they have some extra command points on the first turn of the game, and that's it. You're also able to get resources as France, and I believe as Spain. Spain has La Mesta here, which that counter may have some other purpose. No, I think I was told to put that on the board. This is where they have to link to export their sheep, their wool, and they'll get resources off of that. And the French have resources that they get off Mediterranean and North Sea trade. Paris itself is up here, a sort of a box that's like unable to be dealt with by anyone else. Seville is kind of special. It's a port, even though it's inland, but only if you control Jerez. Obviously a turn track. Returning units. When units are coming back from overseas, from the world map or whatever, they go onto there, and then they end up showing up in the turn track for the next turn or whatever. These over here, these are French specific. The various powerful French nobles, noble houses. France is not really a nation yet. You could say Spain isn't either, because it's divided into, you know, 2 powers that are having a civil war in each of them, basically. But France also is not a national power in the same way that you'd consider it later on. But there, it's less a direct military conflict and more simply the powers that the various nobles have, which was the truth in Spain too, but they took it to military conflict, right? But in France, the French are able to spend command points and maybe some card effects, etc., to move these tracks forward. Once they get them cleared out, they get a victory point, and they get some. They might get additional cards as well off of them. So the more that they control their country, the stronger their card, their hand of cards is going to be each year. All right, that's the map for the cards. Each nation has a number of home cards. They have 3 each, which are powerful cards, ranking normally 5 points. This one's worth 6, which generally have multiple events that you could choose to trigger off of them. So you can use them for the command point. They're like any other event card. You can use them as the command, well, not quite, but you can use them as the command points, or you could use them as the events. I don't believe you can pass if you have one of your home cards in your hand still. So you've got to get rid of them before you start threatening to end the turn. And I guess that's about it. There's also the Papal Bull card, which works kind of like a home card. Whoever controls the Pope gets that. And at the beginning of the game, the French control the Pope. That can change. I think the Muslims can control the Pope even. Under certain special circumstances. You have it's a single deck of cards that's shared with a bunch of turn indicated changes to the deck. So new cards go into the deck as the turns go by. And cards come out because there are single play cards that if they're played as their event, they are removed from the game. There are mandatory events in there, which kind of like the home cards, you can't pass if you have one in your hand, and you must play it for the event. There's some weird thing. There are some things you'll be used to in there: combat cards and reaction cards, which are nicely labeled, much better than in Time of Wars. I remember having difficulty being able to tell what things were. Nowhere near as much trouble as I did with Clash of Sovereigns. But anyway, you also have a couple of, okay, first of all, this is added, this is the ruler of the Muslim player that gets played as soon as the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada is destroyed. And then these are additional home cards that get added on turn 2, 3, or 4 to the powers. Some of the home cards may get removed. So for example, this one I believe gets removed once the Nasrids are gone. This one comes in on turn 4. Okay. The cards themselves, let's get to a component statement here, unfortunately are GMT's armored cards. I've spoken about these a lot of times. They are a pain in the ass to shuffle, are really not more sturdy. Like, they seem like they'd be more sturdy. They tend to chip and whatnot. So essentially, you have to put them in card sleeves if you don't want them to get damaged. I am unwilling to deal with card sleeves, so, you know. Mainly because card sleeves make cards harder to shuffle. That's the biggest problem I have with them, is like, sleeves just don't shuffle well. Well, these are almost as hard as shuffling cards in sleeves. It just takes tremendous finger strength. Okay. Let's take a look at other things. Oh, hey, if we're looking at components, a whole bunch of these larger, high-quality colored dice. I never know what to do with these, but anyway. It's a buckets of dice combat system, so it's probably not enough, but whatever. And they're so big that they're hard to cope with for me. I like, you know, look, every game should come with dice, but I tend to scavenge these out and throw them in with my other colored dice. But given that it's got 4 colors for 4 players, it feels kind of like cheap to take the dice out. So I don't know. Armored box, as always. GMT's gotten very good at that. A couple of charts here. I kind of looked at some of these before. We got places for treaties here, the diplomatic status, which is really just whether you're at war or not. Here it says card. That tells you whether or not having an alliance with it gives you a card. That's just the papacy. Some of these others, the numbers here, I'm not really sure what those do. We'll hit them in a little bit. It has to do with getting control of miners when they're attacked, but I don't really remember how they work. I think you want a higher number on there. It gets added to the amount, to the modifier that you have here. This is the level of affinity that different miners have for the players. Once you get control, you put a marker, one of your little hexes up there for it. That affinity is where, whenever there's a reset of the diplomacy for a nation, all that nation's counters start in the same place each time. So it just indicates that, like, you know, hey, look, Florence is kind of pro-Muslim and kind of pro-France because they're anti the others, more or less. Whereas others are maybe less involved. This is the cost it's going to be to increase your modifier for when there's a resolution and when you make that die roll. I think this is also a modifier to the die roll, but I'm not positive of that. We have to see what that is about. Okay. That's those. What do we got for tables? I haven't really paid too much attention. Each player has their own set of rules in terms of a player aid card. So for example, here it tells you how many cards you draw each turn, what your victory points are based on, and strategic spaces, those are the triangles. They have the same value as keys do in general. Home keys are a little different though. But then here's a whole list of all the special victory points that they can have, and then bonus victory points I think are going to be the same for each nation. Those apply to everyone. And then you have the sequence apply. So it's not really all that different for each player. Really, the cards drawn, that's different rules for each player, and then the special victory points. So that's a helpful piece of information, or a helpful display of information. Then you have one of these for each player. These are all the same, and they give you various charts that are within the game. The mandatory events that have to happen, if they did not happen during play yet, they get triggered by that. That's kind of like the Clash of Monarchs, Clash of Sovereigns rules. New rulers and leaders. And when they show up, roles for when trying to get resources back across from difficult locations, navigation, the different trade tables that give you points on them, whether or not you get cartography off of something, and then the rules for piracy are on there. I think this is long enough for the first part of the intro. It's giving you kind of an overview of the components and whatnot and what they do. The game is going to be very much in core mechanisms similar to Here I Stand. Take away the religion, add, you know, some more rules for exploration and whatnot. That's become more complicated. We've added a few things. There's a new type of space, these triangles here, which is a victory point space that is not a key. That's important because keys get you to the automatic victory. These do not. These just generate victory points for you. Now, obviously, each player has their own individual victory points as well, which is what most of these counters are about. But they also have the number of triangles that they've collected as an additional value that's on there. Combat, like I said, is going to be buckets of dice, but we have lots of different combat units in this. And what are the differences with the combat units? Well, The designer says that the militia are kind of like mercenaries. They've got different rules as to how they go away and whatnot, but they're cheaper to build than regular units, and they're a little less effective. Cavalry is potentially more effective, but you end up risking it. Well, you end up taking your losses on the cav if you end up doing a cav charge, but you do get extra dice for doing that. I think hits are on 5s and 6s, just like in here, the rest of the series. Siege artillery only really help you when you're assaulting a town, a fortress. You have the capacity to build fortresses. We have a couple of these markers for each player. You can imprison people. These things, I think, are markers just to indicate special conditions. So everybody has this rise of universities, which allows them to start generating victory points. And it's kind of a push your luck type thing, I think. I'm not sure. I didn't get a really good grasp of that. That was one of the many special rules that's in this. The difference in the two types of keys, these are the home keys. Tlemcen and Algiers don't start on the board, so the Muslims don't have the victory points for them, and they can't win the game until that part of the power comes into play. What about on here? Okay, charisma tells you how many. I'm trying to remember these. I don't remember. These basically determine how many cards you draw each turn and how many you're allowed to hold, if I recall correctly. However, I'm not really thrilled with this because I thought charisma is the draw, so I don't know what admin actually does. We can look that up real quickly. Or not. Let's see. 3.3. Yeah, the administrative rating is how many cards they can save. The charisma is how many cards they're dealt each turn. So some of these have like admin of 0. Also, the French have to get their cards off of consolidating their power. I don't think these are all worth a card. But they don't seem to say on there. I don't remember. I spent so much effort with the setup, and the rules took me so long to read that I don't remember everything. We're going to be going over the rules as usual. It's going to be a royal pain, and this is probably going to be broken up into at least 2 more videos, just doing the introduction to get us there. And trying to think what else we got. We got leaders who have a couple different values on them. One of them is sort of their tactical value, which is how good they are in combat, and I don't remember. Let's see how these are. The top number is their battle rating, how good they are at combat and interception. And then the bottom number is the command rating, which is how many units they can command. Once you define a force with a leader, you can move it, and it basically generally costs 1 command point to move 1 space with 1 stack of units. Is again very much like Here I Stand. Fortresses have to be sieged. Let me think. Another thing that's new is we have multiple different types of markers. So you have the keys, And you have these little hexes to indicate change of control for areas that are not keys. Okay, that all makes sense. And then you have triangles for these triangular spaces. Something clever could have been done with the triangles, kind of like the key track, but there's no automatic victory on it, so there's no actual limit to how many triangles you can have, which is kind of problematic. And then there's weird things like this, where I think this is, so there's no control marker for Portugal here. These are Portuguese troops within whatever, the Beltraneja territory. They're helping defend it. There's no marker for the Beltraneja control there. And I don't think they need one. It's kind of interesting because their territory is split up into lots of different places, their home territory. You can only build your own stuff in your own home territory, home keys, I think, with some exceptions, of course. And let me think. There's the capability for territories to become home territories that aren't to begin with. So, for example, Granada can become part of Spain's home territory within the course of this game. And there may be some other cases like that. I can't think of any offhand. You're going to start things off, and I think this is the same in Here I Stand, but I don't recall. It's been so long since I played it. But I've seen this before. And by playing 2 cards face down at the beginning of each turn, one is an event that you want triggered, and the other is a card to support that event by putting its CP value, and the higher CP values, the higher CP value bid allows you to get your headline event played. And then that'll, I think, determine the order of play. Yeah, I don't remember much. The rules have kind of blurred on me. Fighting my way through 20 pages of absolutely procedural special case instances basically made me forget the core of the game. So, anyway. We're going to go over that core of the game in the next video, and then maybe we go over the special cases. The rules as a whole, outside of the decision to have made this game out of to make a CDG into something this bloated, they appear pretty good so far. I may end up running into problems. I always do. I have trouble reading, whatever. I'm also enjoying the historical information. I haven't made it through, but I'm reading through that. There's some designer's notes, which I have read, give you an idea of the, sort of what the main goals for each player are, which is very, very helpful. There is there's set up for there's 2 scenarios to it. One that's shorter. Basically, if you start early, there's one that starts on turn 4 instead. You still play it out for the full game. Either there's no like early scenario, late scenario, and then full campaign or anything like that. It's just, when do you want to start, and you play to the end, whatever that is. There is an example of play in detail. I, of course, did not read that. I don't believe it would do much. It might answer some of the questions that I've come up with as or it might have given me some reminders if I had read it, and then I wouldn't be quite as in the dark about the things that I read in the rules before I hit the barrier of, oh my God, how many fucking special rules does this game actually have? Because honestly, it feels like Europa Universalis in terms of the special rules that each country has and all kind of shit like that. Just the amount of detail on that kind of crap. Now, That's outside of events. Some of the special rules are triggered by cards, but I can tell you anything that doesn't have a card or a reminder for it of some sort, I'm probably going to forget half of them at least. So I don't know if the game is going to at all play historically accurately in my hands for the simple fact that I got to keep too much in my head at all times. It's not like, oh, remember that in period X this happens. No, these are all things that are triggered by you taking a space or, whatever happens, they're triggered. And I'm hoping that somehow it all falls together. I know that with my first play of EU, it didn't all fall together perfectly. I screwed some shit up. I'm expecting to screw shit up here. I'm expecting it to be worse here, to be honest, even though it's a smaller game. There's something else I wanted to touch on. I know that. Yeah. So the reason reading the example of play isn't going to do me a lot of good is that so much of the game appears to be special cases that I'm like, okay, I'll know the special cases that got invoked here maybe, but it's not going to help me, right? Like, most of what's really new in this game is those special cases, is just this overburdening layer of additional crap on top of everything. I liked the Here I Stand system. I feel like all three games that I'm certain are really heavily derived from it have just gone overboard. Virgin Queen less than this, and Time of Wars. Time of Wars had the horrible problem of having a really bad rule book. This rule book does not appear to be anywhere near that kind of problem. It appears to have been, heavily dealt with. And I went over, there's a significant number of playtesters listed. That's a good sign. You've got the game designer, but I'm guessing it says series designer and developer. I think Ed Beach served as a developer for this particular game, as well as designing the original Here I Stand game. And he also did the English rules editing. That is very, that's promising, right? When you have someone who's invested in the system and can look at the work. The thing is, with Virgin Queen, Beach took that hard left turn into, let's start throwing more stuff onto the system. People could handle Here I Stand. I wanted to make it richer than that. I want to make it more detailed and more specific and, make the events more historically linked. What it kind of does is it kind of scripts everything more. Here I Stand itself felt like a lot of really weird shit could happen in it. I'm not sure as much weird shit could happen in Virgin Queen. I'm not sure it couldn't. Because there was so much crud on top of that core system that it was hard to see what was actually going on anymore. And I fear this game is going to be the same kind of thing. Did I have that with EU? Not so much. Probably because of that clear distinction between that planning phase where you're working on a spreadsheet and then fighting out the battles. I could see things and I could say, oh, wow, this is happening very differently. Or, it's funny, but there just doesn't seem to be anything to motivate Spain or Portugal to go into North Africa in EU. There is in this. There definitely is in this. Outside of, hey, you have a victory point objective to do this, but it's like, I know it's hard to do all the stuff that is really good to do. Why do I want to do something risky and hard, that's not going to probably pay off as well? But that's a problem with the victory point system for EU. Anyway, I'm suspecting that this is actually, if you can grasp the game, there's probably a pretty decent game underneath all that crud. Just like there was in, from what I can tell from Virgin Queen, from what other people tell me. I couldn't tell from my play because there was too much crud in the way. You put too much in there, and I start not being able to see through it all. Similarly with EU Pop, I'm not at all convinced that there's any balance in that thing. That thing feels like it is more in the flavor of the original Europa Universalis in that, maybe we need to balance something. Okay, we'll do this, we'll do that. But that it was never really play tested to the degree that this appears to have been, at least in terms of looking at that list of play testers. That's a very appealing thing. Now, maybe they wrote down everybody's name who had anything to do with playtesting, but I doubt that. All right, my battery's about run, so I'm going to load this up. This is part A of the introduction. We'll start digging into the really boring parts of it, which is just reading the rules primarily aloud. That helps remind me, and it gives you more context as to what's going on.